Without warning or consultation, Trump slapped 35% tariffs on Canada, 25% on Japan, Reuters reported on July 11, 2025. Allies are now targets, noted Politico. Letters, not negotiations, define U.S. trade policy.
Have been charging very, very high tariffs to our farmers, some over 200%. And they've been treating our farmers very badly. They've been treating our country very badly for years. And look, we like Canada. I love Canada. I have so many friends in Canada. But they've been very poorly led. They've been very, very poorly led. And all we want is fairness for our country.
What started as a tweet storm turned into a trade quake, shaking the foundations of two of America's closest alliances. Canada remained silent. Japan recalibrated. The White House thundered ahead. And somewhere between diplomatic insult and economic chaos, the meaning of partnership collapsed. Bilateral trust is no longer damaged, it's disintegrating. Two of the most reliable allies in U.S. history are quietly shifting away, forging new futures without Washington at the center. And here's the question: what happens when your friends stop waiting and start walking? For decades, the United States, Canada, and Japan formed the backbone of global economic stability. Through NATO, the G7, and countless bilateral trade agreements, their alliance anchored global supply chains, stabilized markets, and set the tone for post-war capitalism. Canada was more than a neighbor. It was the U.S.'s largest trading partner, providing energy, agriculture, and critical minerals. Japan, meanwhile, served as both a key industrial partner and a geopolitical counterweight in East Asia. American cars used Canadian steel and Japanese electronics. Japanese factories built in Ohio and Ontario employed thousands. Canadian electricity lit up homes in New York. Goods flowed across borders with little friction, underpinned by trust, rules, and decades of cooperation. But under the surface, tensions had begun to build. Trump's first presidency in 2016 tested the waters. Tariffs on steel and aluminum in 2018 rattled both allies, but the system held. COVID strained supply chains further. Then came whispers of America First 2.0, a second Trump term driven not by alliance management, but economic intimidation. Allies began to hedge. Japan deepened trade ties with ASEAN. Canada pushed for a deal with Mercosur. Still, they remained diplomatically cautious until the morning of July 11, 2025. Without warning, the White House announced blanket tariffs on Canadian and Japanese goods via a string of Truth Social posts. No calls, no consultations, just directives. It wasn't just policy, it was personal. Letters sent directly to heads of state warned that tariff levels would rise or fall based on national behavior. For Ottawa and Tokyo, this wasn't protectionism, it was coercion. The old rules had shattered. The U.S. was no longer treating its allies like partners, but like problems to be managed. And the trust that took generations to build began to fracture in a matter of days. The American provocation. It was a Friday morning when the digital ink spilled across Truth Social. Without a press conference or prior leaks, Donald Trump announced via direct post, effective immediately, a 35% tariff on all Canadian goods, 25% on Japan. We will raise or lower depending on behavior. America first. There was no elaboration, just follow-up messages taunting Canada's globalist prime minister and warning Japan that free rides are over. What followed was policy by tweetstorm. Within hours, the U.S. trade representative scrambled to formalize the new tariffs. Legal teams weren't briefed in advance. Commerce Department officials were still digesting the news when calls from Tokyo and Ottawa began pouring in. No answers, no apologies, just more tweets. The administration later justified the move as a necessary economic recalibration to correct decades of lopsided trade. Trump accused Canada of exploiting U.S. markets through unfair subsidies and lambasted Japan for dumping cars and tech into American cities while protecting their own. Behind the bluster was a strategy. Trump's team believed allies would cave quickly, offering investment deals, subsidies for U.S. firms, or defense spending increases in exchange for tariff relief. It wasn't entirely unfounded. Similar pressure had led Mexico to tighten its southern border in 2019. But this time, the calculus failed. Instead of concession, the U.S. was met with cold resistance. Japan publicly condemned the tariffs as a betrayal of trust between long-standing partners. Canada issued no official press conference, but quietly instructed its ambassadors to begin market diversification acceleration. Still, the damage was immediate. Japanese automakers like Toyota and Nissan saw stock prices drop more than 6% within 24 hours. Canadian energy exporters faced order freezes as American clients scrambled to renegotiate contracts or seek waivers. The Nikkei 225 dropped 7.8% in a single day. Even U.S. businesses were caught off guard. General Motors, which relies on Japanese components and Canadian parts, warned of disruptive delays to 2025 production lines. Grain elevators in Minnesota reported stalled cross-border shipments to Alberta. Trump doubled down. "If our allies want trade, they need to play by our rules," he posted. "No exceptions. No more weak deals." He offered no definition of our rules. That, it seemed, would change day to day. Markets panicked. Diplomats scrambled. But for Canada and Japan, a decision had been made. They would not play this game. Canada and Japan strike back quietly. If the American response was thunder, the Canadian and Japanese answer was ice. Canada's counterstrike began in silence. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, didn't call a press conference. He didn't send fiery letters to Washington. Instead, he assembled his economic war room and activated what insiders called the Pacific Shift Protocol, a strategy years in the making. Carney's team expedited a multi-phase plan already in motion: market diversification. Within weeks, Canadian exports to the UK, EU, India, and Indonesia surged. Ottawa finalized a new grain deal with Brazil and fast-tracked FTA negotiations with Mercosur. Logistics rewiring. Shipments that once moved through Detroit and Buffalo began flowing through ports in Vancouver and Halifax. The Trans-Pacific Corridor expanded with subsidized shipping lanes to Tokyo, Singapore, and Jakarta. Financial independence. The Bank of Canada launched new settlement protocols to de-dollarize select exports, allowing transactions in euros, yen, and even rupiah. Canadian energy firms began quoting contracts in multiple currencies to reduce exposure to U.S. policy volatility. No sound bites, just strategy. While Trump posted memes, Carney flew quietly to Brussels, Jakarta, and Hanoi, securing long-term trade commitments without fanfare. The results were subtle but seismic. In just 3 months, Canada reduced its export dependency on the U.S. from 78% to 68%. For a country historically tied to its southern neighbor, that drop was extraordinary. Meanwhile, in Japan, the response was surgical. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba condemned the tariffs as deeply regrettable. But behind the scenes, his government took calculated steps. Supply chain rerouting. Japanese manufacturers expanded plants in Vietnam and India. Tech components once shipped to the U.S. were now redirected toward EU clients. Dual-track strategy. Tokyo negotiated a new investment deal with Washington, committing $550 billion into U.S. factories in exchange for tariff reductions on some auto and industrial goods. But this wasn't capitulation. It was hedging. Strategic retreat. Simultaneously, Japan strengthened its digital economy ties with ASEAN and the EU. A new AI consortium with Germany and France was announced. Defense tech sharing with Australia and South Korea intensified. Political messaging. Japanese officials met with South Korean and EU counterparts to quietly coordinate a shared stance. The U.S. is becoming unpredictable. We must prepare accordingly. Tokyo and Ottawa understood one thing Washington didn't. This wasn't about winning a tweet war. It was about survival in a post-American global order. The stalemate sets. In 3 months into the tariff crisis, the global economy had absorbed the shock, but not the consequences. No country declared a trade war. No bullets flew. No G7 meetings were canceled outright. But the silence was louder than any sanctions. In Washington, Trump's administration insisted that allies are coming back to the table, but they weren't. They were building new tables elsewhere. Canadian trade officials finalized wheat and beef export deals with Vietnam and Malaysia. Japanese automakers announced a joint venture in the Philippines without a single U.S. supplier involved. Even Australian logistics firms reported increased cargo volumes on trans-Pacific routes, bypassing California altogether. Meanwhile, American farmers, manufacturers, and importers found themselves in limbo. Waivers were inconsistently granted. Exemptions were unpredictable. Investment flows became cautious, uncertain, stalled. Neither side could afford to escalate, but neither could back down. The Trump administration feared political embarrassment if it rolled back the tariffs. Canada and Japan feared greater dependence if they yielded to economic bullying, and so the stalemate held. Foreign policy analysts described it as a cold divorce. No rupture, no reconciliation, just deliberate distancing. In Ottawa, one official summed it up quietly. "We didn't choose to abandon the U.S. We were pushed to survive without them." In Tokyo, an editorial in Asahi Shimbun declared, "America has stopped asking. It only demands." By year's end, the numbers told the story. Canadian trade with ASEAN rose 19%. Japanese investment into Europe grew 22%. U.S. cross-border trucking with Canada fell 16%. Auto exports from Japan to the U.S. dipped sharply. The damage wasn't explosive, it was cumulative, and the world, once led by the gravity of U.S. alliances, was now slowly learning to orbit elsewhere. The fallout in Canada. In Mississauga, Ontario, the aerospace manufacturer Novacor Systems had long supplied precision parts to Boeing plants in the U.S. Midwest. For 22 years, the relationship was stable, predictable, and mutually beneficial. But by late July 2025, just 2 weeks after the tariff announcement, Novacor's $18 million contract was suspended indefinitely. Boeing cited tariff uncertainties and regulatory risk as the reason. Novacor, which employed 380 workers, was suddenly in crisis. 3 production lines halted. Nearly 100 workers were laid off. CEO Rami Deshpande called the move a wake-up call for every Canadian business tied to the American market. And Novacor wasn't alone. According to data from Budget Lab at Yale, Canada's GDP contracted 2.1% in Q3 2025, the largest quarterly drop since the pandemic. While some of that stemmed from global conditions, the lion's share came from disrupted exports, frozen cross-border logistics, and capital outflow caused by shaken investor confidence. Trade figures told the deeper story. Canadian exports to the U.S. fell by 7.7 billion Canadian dollars compared to the previous quarter. Sectors hardest hit included aerospace, lumber, and agriculture. Freight volumes at border crossings like Windsor and Sarnia plummeted by 22%. The ripple effects extended to Canadian pension funds, many of which were heavily invested in U.S.-linked infrastructure and logistics projects. With U.S. policy suddenly unpredictable, fund managers began pulling back, redirecting capital into more stable environments like the EU and Singapore. The Canadian government responded with a stimulus package targeting trade diversification and domestic manufacturing, but the psychological toll remained. "We're not angry," said Deshpande. "We're cautious. That's worse in the long term." Many Canadian firms began rewriting contingency plans with one assumption baked in. The U.S. is no longer a stable anchor. Even for those who didn't lose contracts, the lesson was clear. Too much trust in a volatile partner comes at a steep price. The blowback in the United States. In Ohio, the town of Lima depended on one thing: auto parts. For decades, TriStar Forgings, a Tier 2 manufacturer, produced aluminum components for both Japanese automakers and Canadian assembly plants. Roughly 60% of their revenue came from those cross-border clients. In August 2025, they received 2 notices, one from Toyota, the other from a Canadian EV maker. Both were canceling long-term supply contracts. The reason? Tariff instability and production rerouting. Within 10 days, TriStar laid off 140 workers. The factory cut operations to 2 shifts a week. TriStar's story became emblematic across Rust Belt towns. The tariffs, intended to punish foreign manufacturers, ended up whiplashing American suppliers that had thrived within integrated global supply chains. And it wasn't just manufacturing. In the Midwest grain belt, farmers in Minnesota and North Dakota found their agricultural exports to Canada abruptly halted. Once reliable buyers now turned to Brazil and Australia for soy and wheat. Grain silos sat half full. Local banks reported delayed loan repayments. One co-op in Bemidji, Minnesota, folded entirely. At the border, U.S. customs revenue dipped. Truck crossings fell 17% in Buffalo, and storage capacity at key rail depots remained underutilized. Industries tied to the cross-border economy, logistics, packaging, inspections, reported mass slowdowns. Even Wall Street took notice. Goldman Sachs downgraded multiple U.S. logistics stocks. The Dow Transportation Index dipped 3.2% in 1 week. Consumer sentiment surveys conducted by Gallup in October 2025 showed 54% of respondents believed tariffs were hurting American families. Electricity markets were also hit. Northeastern states like Vermont and Maine, long reliant on Canadian hydropower, faced supply shortfalls. Utilities scrambled to buy domestic energy at higher costs, resulting in a 12 to 15% price hike for consumers in the region. Across sectors and states, the narrative repeated. Short-term political wins translated into long-term economic pain. And for many Americans, especially those in industries most affected, one question loomed larger than ever. Was the cost of leverage worth the loss of trust? The fault lines are no longer beneath the surface. They're carved deep into the bedrock of North American trade. What once bound the US, Canada, and Japan was more than economics. It was trust built on decades of stability and shared vision. Now, that foundation has cracked under the weight of politics, unpredictability, and unilateral decisions. All sides are recalibrating, but not together. Canada and Japan have learned to move forward without Washington at the center. The US, meanwhile, insists on being the gravitational force, even as others quietly adjust their orbits. And here's the question we must now confront. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or fail apart, trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your view in the comments below.